Hello and welcome to the Talented Amateurs Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Randolph. This is the show where we shine a light on everyday people doing extraordinary things, the dreamers, the builders, and the go-getters, who may not be household names, but whose stories and talents are worth celebrating. Today, we have Victor Patterson, who is an executive and human resource professional. He also runs his own podcast, Pod to T Green Podcast. Today, we'll be discussing pivot to transition and dive into how he balances the life as a leader, executive, and entrepreneur. Victor, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
I'm great, Joe. Thanks for having me. Congratulations on the progress and the success that you're having here with this podcast. And I am truly honored to be a guest on something that continues to grow and get better and better. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And I'm definitely excited to have you on. I've known you, followed your career, always been someone that I always admired and looked to as far as how you've managed your career, the kind of roles and the challenges that you've taken. And you've taken on some big roles. And we'll dive into a little bit of that today, but just want to give you your flowers just based on the way you've been able to cultivate your career, but then also just how you show up as an authentic way. And so I just appreciate you and really honored for you to be joining us today.
Thank you.
And so as we get started, maybe Victor, maybe just share a bit about your journey and, what inspired you to pursue kind of just your MBA. You've gone into human resources and you've been into different phases of organizational leadership. Maybe just share us a little bit about your journey and who you are.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I think it's important to share that I am a kid from suburban Chicago, grew up under the parental privilege of two parents. Mother was obviously the strong influence in my life, in addition to the maternal side of my family. As a child, I played sports. I played all three sports. Ultimately went to school with the opportunity to play basketball. Fortunately, transitioned into the corporate space. And as a professional, I've had the opportunity to serve on the operations side in a leadership role, an individual contributor in a sales role, and then in human resources space, both as an individual contributor up to the executive level. I come to you with a bachelor's degree in finance and economics, and then a master's degree in business. Fortunately, I've been able to use though my professional career, and I know that we'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll have the opportunity to inject some of that into my answers. So that's who I am.
And you reside in Atlanta, correct?
Correct.
Let's talk about, maybe share a little bit about all the different places you live. I always like to highlight folks who've enjoyed or taken advantage of being mobile and, kind of tell us a little bit about kind of your journey and as you move from state to state.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I appreciate the question. There are people that celebrate that. I still think that there's value in being mobile, although we see a number of people that really find themselves comfortable with where they're at, and that's completely fine. Again, as someone that grew up in suburban Chicago, I understood that the world was a different place, much different than the world that I grew up in. And I'm grateful for that, but I was curious. And so as I started my professional career, and I would say, Joe, that basketball actually started to water that curious seed. And being in the professional space and understanding that relationships and performance oftentimes give you the opportunity to do more than you were once doing. I focused on that. But in terms of where have I lived? Well, obviously it started in suburban Chicago. I went to Central Illinois. I went to Minneapolis, St. Paul, the Twin Cities area. I've lived in Hampton Roads, Virginia. I've lived in Central Florida. I've lived in Southern Cal, specifically Newport Beach, Irvine. I feel like I'm missing some place, but maybe that's it. So a number of different places. And I would also say that through these different opportunities, I've had responsibility for many more places that have allowed me to become familiar with those places without actually living in the places.
No, and that's pretty awesome. And the reason why I like that is when you see most professionals that reach your level or have reached your level from an executive perspective, typically it may require you to move maybe one or two
Mhm.
times. And in some cases, it's more so a ask tell versus you really having the option, or you do have the option to stay, but it could have a limit on your career and your growth.
Correct.
But at that level, sometimes you have to move around, and then sometimes the role requires. I was sitting in a room with some other director level folks, and I think the average place that each person had lived was probably between 4 to 7 different places and cities,
Mhm.
and it also included globally. And so,
Mhm.
as you reach certain levels, some of that mobility and the ability to move and pivot is key.
Correct.
And so thanks for sharing that, because I think it is beauty. And just sometimes I tell people all the time, just leave home and then
Yeah.
let's see how much you grow. You can always go back. Now, with your career, and as we kind of think about your career and your leadership and just how you've been able to evolve your career, you've also been known as the turnaround specialist, right? And so with your strengths in HR, sales, operations, entrepreneurship, can you maybe walk us through and how you came to having that title, but then more importantly, maybe some of the challenges as you kind of grown throughout your career in those different spaces. How did you handle them? What was your approach? And, and how did what were some of the outcomes that you've been able to achieve?
Certainly, Joe. And I'll give you two. And, I think, and I was probably less conscious about the turnaround. And then one was, and it was at a point where I started to understand that this could potentially be a superpower of mine as a leader. The first one that I'll share with you happened, and as I said, my first leadership job was an operations manager. I had 19 people that I was responsible for, and that included non-exempt and exempt. Many of my team were very seasoned and certainly older than I was. We had the responsibility, stated or otherwise, or just inherent, to ensure that we were providing a level of service, but maybe more importantly, that we were profitable and that we were profitable in support of the organization's goals. In this particular case, Joe, we were not. We were losing money almost as often as the days of the week. We were in a position that we were not able to raise rates, which obviously would have given us a heightened level of revenue. And so having that in front of me, a few things that I did, and I think this comes to the essence of who I've become and how I approach leadership. I galvanized my team. And one of the things that I think is my DNA is I like to engage people that are closest to the execution. And so my team was that. They understood what was going well, what wasn't going so well. Strategically, I understood where we needed to be. And so that engagement was part of the plan that I ultimately put together. Relationship building is another key piece of success at any level of an individual's career. And so what I ultimately did at that point is I pieced together the strategy. I had to sell it to executives. The plan at its core included eliminating unprofitable business. Ultimately, it was taking a money out of a lot of successful people's hands, but it was something that needed to be done. Additionally, the plan included an opportunity to get back at volume, but to get back also at profitable volume. And so getting selling that, getting the support for it, again, relationship building, and then being inclusive and empowering. My team comes back in, they're in support of it. I create a plan that allows them to do what they do well. some of that, or at least a portion of it, was doing something that had never been done prior to my arrival. And that included taking my team and sending them out to the field, kind of a new experience that had never been had. And we did an amazing job. We increased profitability 15% above where it was. We obviously eliminated the bad trend. But I would also tell you, Joe, that in that I'm very much a data fan. And so it goes back to my obviously my professional career, but my academic background as well. I've always been a fan of data, the trend of data, and then the story that it tells. And so that helped me also identify, hey, what do we need to do? What don't we need to do? Who do we need to get engaged? And so I think that was probably the first big footprint, as I said unconsciously, that helped me understand that I am a turnaround specialist. Maybe the point where I began to understand that consciously this is my superpower for a big retailer, and I've worked for Fortune 50 companies. That's been my career. In this case, I walked into an opportunity where my leader said, argue or debatably, you have and you will support two operators who are the most difficult in the enterprise. And the climate and the culture was apathetic at best. And that's the word that I use. And so sharing that with you and your audience here isn't something that has not been heard. I needed to stop the turnover. We were losing, for every person that we hired, we were losing a person and a half.
Mm.
I needed to get buy-in, and this was a multi-regional responsibility. And then we needed to set our feet 10 toes down and really begin to drive what that strategy was. And so a few things that I had to do there. Again, I created what I call the culture committee. And that included one non-exempt employee from each of the stores that I had responsibility for. I went in and hosted listening sessions, ask a question, and then just hear it all and not really create a filter or kind of create a board, if you will, that they can't go beyond. So I understood in totality what the challenges were. I had to pull both of my business partners aside and really have a conversation with them about how they were showing up versus how we needed them to show up. And so there was some executive coaching in the side. The strategy was inclusive of the group of individuals that I just shared with you, our frontline leaders, and then certainly an understanding of where we needed to go and my voice as well. The execution of that was a strategy, but Joel, a few things happened. I was able to drive employee engagement an average of 25% better, 25% increase over
Okay.
what was. We completely slowed down that turnover. In fact, there was another aspect of the business, and we got so good that employees from the other side of the business wanted to come to our side of the business as well. And
Wow.
then from a performance standpoint, we not only added value to our associates, but our metrics were so good that our service providers and our clients continued giving us more and more business. And so when I think about the impact, I had moved away from that job. One of my business partners enthusiastically reached out to me and said, Victor, we did it. And what he meant by that is that region had crossed the threshold that the organization had established as a defining metric that suggested one, your workforce is highly engaged, and two, it is equally profitable. And so
Mm.
his message was, we did it. He expressed gratitude for the work and support that I did to kind of turn that around, including reshaping how he showed up as a leader.
No, thanks for sharing it. And I think one of the things that resonated with that is you built a culture. And
Mhm.
with this podcast, part of what I like to do is highlight leaders and how they are running large businesses or entrepreneurs or how they're scaling organizations. And part of that is how we build culture. And so I love the fact that you had a cultural piece in that. And so when you think about that, and you also mentioned data, what a lot of leaders have a hard time managing with the data and how to make decisions with the data, but also shifting culture. What do you think made you so successful in doing that? Just elevating performance and then also transforming workplace culture.
Uniquely, Joe, again, as I was coming up, as was a young adult and an early career professional, it was the time where often in domestically anyway, organizations and institutes of higher education talked about quality leadership or quality leaders generally came from two places. One, it was the military, or two, it was sports. And so when I think of my grounding, when I think of my foundation, that's where it came from. There's a competitive side of me, there's a data-driven side of me, but I often tell a story that my last year of high school, I was the MVP of the conference. And when I tell people that, I tell them the only reason that I was is because the five people who rarely played were the five people that challenged me when it wasn't game days. And so inviting all people in to have an impact on identifying what success is and what it isn't, and then inviting them in to have a voice on what success ultimately is, seemingly was a part of my DNA. And so the marriage of the two at any point in time in my career is just natural for me because of my sports background. And Joe, even today, when I'm coaching leaders at any level from the C suite down, I really talk to them about what is the intersection between your unconscious pursuit for these numbers on Monday's scorecard and the level of engagement with your employees. People that have worked with me know that I am apt to say, you are either running fast to nowhere or you're extremely bright in putting a strategy together, but the strategy is empty if you don't have the people's buy-in to execute it. And
Yep.
so I really try and center leaders today to make sure that they are aware of the balance, and then I play a part in helping them find the balance.
And I love that because I always say you can never get the stuff done without people, right?
Mhm.
If the people don't feel bought in, if the people don't feel valued or they're not connected, we can never get, I call it the stuff done, right?
Right.
But if you can get that right, the people, then that'll allow you to deliver and drive results. So thanks
Absolutely.
for sharing. I think that's really important. You mentioned you work with a few notable brands. Well, you didn't mention names, but you did work with a few notable brands from Home Depot, Target to Lowe's. What did you learn from those experiences at some of those big, large brands that span across your career?
Yeah, I think there's a few things, and certainly there's two sides of the coin, and there are things that are good and great, and then things that are not so great. I think, when I think about how they shape me, those big organizations are often very process driven, essentially run the play, right? Run the play because the play has worked. Be consistent with the play. So behavior is important. Messaging is important. I think the flip side of that, and I think this is really important for your listeners, particularly, is there is least favor with those type of organizations in someone who has a creative thought and
Mm.
someone who is creative and curious and likes to explore new ideas and maybe tinker, not necessarily getting off of the radar or the beat path from the shared objective, but they
Uh,
just have a really entrepreneurial approach and they want to at least test that. And I think your larger organizations are less risk averse to people like that, where process is really good. I think the other thing is the importance of understanding your marketplace and the dynamics. One of the organizations that I worked for, I think you mentioned, was Target. My experience there was phenomenal. Target did a really good job of definitively understanding their market. And so there was no ambiguity on what the dynamics and the elements were. And subsequently, Target was able to align the organization to that shared pursuit, to that shared organization, and everything just kind of flowed. And for as big as the brand is, was a really heightened period where the organization understood that there were diverse markets that required unique attention. And I think organizationally, Target leaned into that and subsequently had tremendous success.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. And and I think you're right. When you in some organizations, you have the freedom to be creative and
Mhm.
go in and just have kind of a blank canvas to be abstract. While some it's a process, and you have to be able to fit into the process and help manage the process. There may be some areas where you can deviate scale, and
Correct.
where there may be new go to markets, but overall, you have to follow within that process.
Correct.
And so one of the things you mentioned earlier, it was you mentioned you coach a lot of executives at the C-suite, as you think about that. As we think about leadership and talent and development, just as a trusted advisor and a mentor to executives and broader talent, how do you tailor your coaching across different levels of an organization or the different levels or at the C-suite and executive levels?
I think it's important with the way that you phrase the question, specifically recognizing that there are various levels in an organization, which means, and I know that you know this, which means that you have to tailor your message differently. And part of that is understanding where with some, you can give them kind of a two-paragraph coaching, if you will. With others, it probably needs to be a concise two or three sentence pitch. I, by nature, am a really good active listener. And as we've talked about, I'm as invested as an HR professional in the ROI equation as some of my functional peers are. And so when I think about having conversations with executives, part of it is making sure that I help sensitize them to the employee base and how that marries to the market. I can think of an example where I stepped into a role, it was new, we needed to do some transformation, and my business partner was extremely competent in this space, but he was a little distant from his employees. And so one of the things, and we talk about this in leadership and competency development, is leading courageously. And at the executive level, you have to be comfortable with having very candid conversations. And candid conversations, which at times can sting, but they're never personal. And so being able to shift, find that moment that ultimately is a very focused and quiet moment. I tend to be someone who asks questions to engage that individual. And then my questions and my statements and my coaching, my guidance, if you will, tends to one be directed towards where we're trying to go. But also if I see that there's some slippage to our people, I'm reshaping their profile through those conversations. And I'll also say that I've been fortunate in that all of my business partners, whether it's at the VP level or the C-suite level, have given me voice and have allowed me to have an open door to have those conversations. When I think about going downhill, one, the ability to listen, to display levels of humility, and to use that to bring a group of employees together. One of the things that often happens in the corporate space is your employees understand the level or your title and what that means. And there tends to be some level of anxiety around that. I like to just break that down and present myself as a person similar to them. That then allows me to be very actively engaged. I ask questions about what they need, what they're aware of. If there are things that I need to change, I'll make a commitment to it. But I never end a conversation without asking a level of employees or employee, what is your commitment? What are you willing to give to the shared outcome? And I do so in making sure I educate, making sure I embrace and engage, but also helping them understand that there's a level of accountability that you own that ultimately I will make sure we hold you accountable to. And that that has worked for as long as I've been doing that. I think people find me approachable, which has also allowed me to provide grace and
Yep.
capacity to some of our leaders that I'm working with in those areas of being more engaging and bringing them through, I think, as you mentioned, in a leadership development sort of way. But getting that buy-in and being receptive to understanding that, hey, this person over here may not agree with everything that we're doing, or they may not be engaged at a level that I would like for them to. And I'm going to sit down and figure out why, but I'll also make sure that I'm part of the solution as long as they stay engaged.
Got it. No, thanks for sharing that. Someone who I have a coaching practice as well, so I'm always passionate about being able to coach leaders and director level talent as they continue to think about how they scale and grow. And so when you mentioned you did some coaching, just wanted to expound on that a little bit. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
One question I had as we kind of maybe shift and pivot and start to think about, you currently have you have an entrepreneur background and spirit. You have your podcast that you run today, which is T Degree Podcast as well. Maybe talk a little bit about, some of your entrepreneur pursuits and how they came about, what you're doing, and what are some of the things that you're pulling in from all that you've done across your career into some of the entrepreneur projects that you have going on today.
It's interesting. Again, I go back to I'm someone who's just very curious. I'm very intentional with where I put my feet, eyes, and ears. But I'm also someone who likes to surround myself with people like yourself and others who may be in a space that I'm not in. More recently, as you alluded to, my podcast is T to Green Golf Podcast. Lifelong athlete, someone who transitioned from playing competitive basketball into the sport of golf. But analytically, I've come to understand golf as I did basketball. And so I just found my entrepreneurial spirit or trait, my passion for sport, and my ability to communicate, superpowers, traits, what have you, and then found a venue that allowed all of them to come together. Professionally, I think you've talked about it a minute ago. There's a lot there. I understand the two key areas that make a business successful. In some ways, I've lived them. That's the operations side. I understand the levers that leaders can kind of pull or not pull. From a sales perspective, I've been on the sales side of success and I've had tremendous success as a salesperson. And then the one asset that is undebatable is the ability to bring people along and to move them in the right places. And
Yep.
so the experiences built within those pillars has positioned me as an expert. And I've had some amazing experiences I have someone in my network that I spent with this person helping navigate the acquisition of an organization. And so, being an HR person, I engaged in M&A activity that was not what I was doing at the time, but I did it because of my business background, my sales background, and I was able to provide some nuggets that ultimately helped. As we talked about throughout, shaping how leaders show up, I am someone who believes in effectiveness and efficiency. And so I help leaders not waste time. And again, another one of my adages is if the C-suite is reporting to Wall Street on a basis, why do you get to do what they're asking to be done?
Right.
And so from that, I'm shaping, I'm transforming cultures and how leaders show up. And that's because I fundamentally understand the space that you're in. And ultimately they understand that. So that background, if you will, has allowed me to take on some things and do some things in a way that is not kind of what my core existence is, and that's being an employee for an employer.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing it. I wanted to just ensure we had a chance to kind of get into the podcast a little bit. So, what is your golf game looking like these days?
Ooh. So one, I'm trying to put rounds together. This has
Okay.
been a year unique in that I do not have seven, I don't even think I have 5 rounds of golf calculated in my handicap. But here's what I'll tell you. I've had, I've been, I work hard at it. And because of that, just based on performance and kind of handicap, if you will, I've qualified to play in the Minnesota State Amateur when I lived in the Twin Cities, and I've
Okay.
qualified to play in the Georgia State Amateur while I've been here. And so, with that being said, I understand how to get rhythm and get on the right track again. So, I'm hopeful that before it gets too cold and I get too embedded in the SEC football season, I'll find a few rounds that feel normal to where I believe I'm supposed to be playing. But time isn't on my side.
Okay. Good stuff. Well, there's never too much playing, I guess. It's a matter of just how well you're playing is always the
Correct.
key. And
Correct.
so very good. So as we kind of start to transition and just looking ahead, where do you see yourself in the future? Where do you see the future HR and leadership and how it's evolving? And what are some of the trends that you're seeing across that space that excite you the most?
So where do I see myself? Joe, ultimately, I see myself as a chief HR officer or chief people officer. I am really motivated by the opportunity to shape culture at an enterprise level. And certainly I'm really close. I've done it domestically, I've done it globally at a high level. That's where I see myself and that's where I'm moving towards. There are a number of trends. I think when I think about HR professionals, SHRM is working as hard as they can to ensure that HR professionals are more business partners. And for me, what that means is really understanding the essence of an organization, what the levers are to that business being successful and not being successful. What we hear about often is data competency, data acumen, data-driven decisions. I hope that we make that pivot and that becomes a core competency of the HR profession. Business moves fast, and as you well know, AI is a game changer. And so AI and people analytics, I think that change management will become as synonymous with the HR function as anything else that may be taking place. We understand that we have 4 or 5 generations of employees in the workforce. And so change management really needs to be a part of our DNA. I also think, Joe, that we are going to see the evolution, and I'll call it reinvestment in leaders. I'm not so sure we're where we need to be. I think we have high technical competency, and it's probable that people have been thrust into leadership positions based on their technical competency and not their ability to relate or highlight their interpersonal skills. And so I do see that coming back around. The increase of engagement and reduction of turnover certainly will be a metric that we keep our eye on. Those are a few that come off the top of my head. People analytics, which is obviously tied to data, leadership development, culture is going to be important. And I think the other thing, and I've said this for as long as this topic has been debated, it is important for, in my opinion, important for us to understand that businesses don't drive strategy. The marketplace creates opportunity and businesses respond to it with strategy.
Okay.
And so with that being said, we continue to be in this diverse environment where the marketplace is very unique depending on which direction that you decide to turn. We know that America's GDP largely has been supported by communities of color. I don't think that's going to change. In fact, the education rates seem to be increasing for those communities. And so, whether you choose to call it DE&I or not, or there's some other term that is given it, the impact and the value of communities of color will be influential, and representation mattering will also come back in organizations' ability to be effective to those markets and efficient to those markets. And so I look forward to that being a trend as well.
Awesome. Now, thanks for sharing that. And I think you hit on a lot of key things there, particularly around the leadership piece. I think what we're seeing is we have to rebuild what leaders should be doing and how they should be focused, as well as managing through empathy. We're living in a digital transformation environment. So
Yes.
it's starting to reduce some of the entry level tags. And so leaders have to now be able to manage higher level employees and up. And so that skill level to manage that audience is different than when you're managing maybe early in career professionals, 0 to 5 years. And so I think that's what you mentioned, are the themes that I'm seeing across management and leadership spaces, and where we have to repivot and help them shape and think different, how to manage more with less, but still have to deliver results, but do it with care, do it with building culture. And so
Yes.
there's a balancing act that
Yes.
happens that leaders now have so much more demand on. But to your point, they've been put into roles but not necessarily been built to be able to lead, but they've been built to be able to manage, which is a totally different
Yep.
space. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And listen, I think agility will become real,
Yes,
and the definition of it will become clear, more than simply a buzzword. So I think you're spot on accurate there.
absolutely. So as we start to close out, one of the things I always like to do, one, what are any projects or initiatives that you have coming up professionally or personally that you would like to share?
So I think personally, it's the podcast. Excited about the vision that is coming about, bringing people together to help me bring that vision to reality. Really, what I talk about as it relates to the podcast is my podcast is intended to introduce the golf world to its present and its future. And so I leave your audience with that curiosity, and certainly stay tuned for what we'll be doing on Tea to Green Golf podcast if you have an interest. But that's what we will be doing with the podcast. Professionally, I am working on another project, not ready to share that project in detail, but I do believe that it is intended to talk about the value of leadership in the workplace, engagement in the workplace. So I'm excited about that and the voice that it will create and emanate to a much broader audience.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And so, as we wrap up, we've talked about a few different things from leadership to the evolution of HR to coaching to obviously your podcast and entrepreneurship. If, as the audience walks away today, if there's three things that they should walk away with, what would you share with our listeners? Those three things that they should walk away from today's podcast.
So I think maybe this is three and a half. It's find your voice. We cannot be successful with people not having a voice. And what's interesting about that, Joe, is what we're less aware of in the workplace are people who are naturally introverted.
Oh.
We know those individuals who are extroverted, they always have a voice. But I can tell you that at its core, I'm an introvert. And so I've had to work hard. I've had the support of some of my peers who have recognized that I have introverted tendencies. But it's important that we all find our voice. I think with that, I'll share something with your audience that I shared when I did a commencement address at a university. I think it is critically important for all professionals to have a cohort of peers that are dissimilar for themselves. Again, the world is without borders. And certainly America is fast moving in that direction right now. There is value in creating relationships with people, one, who look like you, but certainly two, people who don't. And listen, I've been doing this with my core running group as a kid, was a first generation immigrant from the Philippines, was a Puerto Rican, was a Mexican, was a Caucasian, and then there was me. And so I had the privilege of at any moment in time being in someone's house and immersed in their family, and it wasn't mine. And then
Right.
conversely, that took place. And so I would marry those two together. I think the
Okay.
other one is continue to develop your technical skills, but don't do that at the expense of your interpersonal skills. Find an opportunity to develop your interpersonal skills and then build yourself up as a quality leader who has high level of technical acumen supported by a high level of interpersonal skills and ultimately be a quality leader and stay curious.
Awesome. No, I love that. I think and finding your voice is so key. And I
Mhm.
tell people all the time, finding your voice can look different, right? It's not always
Mhm.
just having to always speak. It's sometimes just knowing when to speak, right?
Mhm.
Or asking the right question. Or depending on if you're hybrid or if you're in person, sometimes just being visibly present. And
Right.
so your voice can speak several different ways. But most important is making sure that when you do speak, it's of substance, you know, your
Yes.
business, you know, your topic, and you have a point of view. And that's really what I typically coach leaders around in terms of just make sure you have a point of view, right? You don't have
Yes.
to be the one always talking or be the first to talk, but just ensure that you get your voice in the room, take up space, and have a clear point of view. And so I definitely love that. And obviously
Those things.
building a diverse pool of people around you to continue to make sure that you're thinking holistically. So I
Mhm.
love that as well. And so, Victor, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your insights, your words of wisdom. For the audience, hope you guys enjoy the podcast. Please check out Victor's podcast, Tee to Green Golf Podcast, and we look forward to your engagement in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.